Our next guest today is a New York-based journalist who hosts the news show Pushback for the Gray Zone, and he writes regularly for The Nation. His writing also appears at his own Substack, mate.substack.com. In 2019, Aaron received this prestigious Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media from Ithaca College. Please welcome Aaron Mate. Hi, Aaron.
Hello, JD.
So I saw you tweeted this out. You said on February 19th, the Wall Street Journal said German Chancellor Scholz proposed to Zelensky that Ukraine renounce its NATO aspirations and declare neutrality as part of a wider European security deal signed by both Putin and Biden. Zelensky said no, and here is what it is. It says, so that's the German guy, Mr. Scholz, made one last push for the settlement between Moscow and Kiev. He told Mr. Zelensky in Munich on February 19th that Ukraine should renounce its NATO aspirations and declare neutrality as part of a wider European security deal between the West and Russia. The pact would be signed by Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden, who would jointly guarantee Ukraine's security. So this could have avoided a war. It sounds to me like this could have avoided a war. Mr. Zelensky said Mr. Putin couldn't be trusted to uphold such an agreement and that most Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. His answer left German officials worried that the chances of peace were fading. Now, Aaron, what does this look like to you? Does it look to you that for some reason, he's being used as a pawn, Zelensky, and could be?
Yeah, he's definitely being used as a pawn. Here he is being offered by Germany a proposal that he's going to be ultimately have to accept anyway, or else his whole country gets destroyed. Unfortunately, that's just the grim reality of committing to Ukrainian neutrality and not joining NATO. And he knew, and he's admitted this, and you might have the clip, Jimmy.
Oh, here's the clip.
What Zelensky admitted. Let's hear what he admitted. He was told by NATO that you're not going to join, but we're not going to admit that publicly. We're going to keep the door open publicly. So basically, keep the door open publicly to an outcome we're actually not going to accept in practice. Why? Just to bait Russia. So Zelensky chose to risk war to go along with that ruse.
So, yeah, so this will be a translator speaking, but you can
requested them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year or 2 or 5.
So that's Zelensky saying he asked them directly, are you going to allow Ukraine into NATO in a year or 2 or 3 or 5? And what did they say to him? They said this.
Just say it directly and clearly, or just say no. And the response was very clear. You're not going to be a NATO or EU member, but publicly, the doors will remain open.
And so why would they keep the door? So NATO said, no, we're not going to allow Ukraine into NATO. Zelensky seemed to want that. He says the people of Ukraine want that. NATO said, you're not going to get that, but we will publicly pretend that the door is open. Why would NATO want to pretend that publicly the door is open for Ukraine to enter NATO? Aaron?
Well, for one, especially the U.S., the people who run the U.S. are such fanatic Russophobes, Russia haters, that they don't want to give Russia any kind of win, even if it's just a completely symbolic one, like Ukraine not joining NATO, which they apparently agree with anyway. And the more sinister explanation, which I also think is true, is that they wanted to use NATO membership to bait Russia into invading, to use Ukrainians as cannon fodder to bait Russia into a war. And by the way, this is a policy that was set out in a 2019 RAND study. I read about it in my newest article at matcha.substack.com, where this RAND study, a Pentagon-tied think tank, talks about the best ways to overextend Russia. That's the topic of the study. And the top strategy that they come up with is providing more weapons to Ukraine in order to basically compel a Russian invasion. And that would be a way to bleed Russia. So that is what I believe the strategy was. And that's why they wanted to use Zelensky in Ukraine to leave the door open. Basically, leave the door open to NATO publicly, to leave the door open to a disastrous Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Zelensky went along with it.
So even though NATO was never going to allow Ukraine into NATO, they publicly said they might in order to bait Putin into invading Ukraine. why would Zelensky go along with that? Why would the president of Ukraine allow himself to be used as a pawn like that?
Yeah, why would he reject, just days before the invasion, a measure that would essentially enshrine what he was told anyway, which is that Ukraine is not going to join NATO? Again, that proposal you read out from Germany was Ukraine just commit to neutrality and not joining NATO. So why would he reject something that was already reality anyway, according to what he says he was told? Well, for a few things. One, he's sold out to the US. And also because, and this is where I have some sympathy for him, where it is true that if he did agree to make peace with Russia and basically accept neutrality, he would face a coup. The far right in Ukraine have threatened him with a coup and even threatened to kill him. There are far right leaders who have literally threatened Zelensky's life if he makes peace with Russia, including accepting neutrality. So this is where Zelensky, the most generous interpretation you can make is that he was scared for his life. And he knew that if he actually reached an accommodation with Russia along these lines, he would pay the price. Now, where the US has a major responsibility here is that if the US had stepped in and said, we have Zelensky's back, so if he makes peace with Russia, if he accepts neutrality for Ukraine, and if he also ends the war in the Donbass, which he had refused to do, despite being elected on a campaign of peace. Recall that the war in Ukraine didn't start when Putin invaded. It began in 2014 when the US backed a coup, and that coup government essentially launched an assault on Ukraine's ethnic Russian population, who took up arms with Russia's support. And that led to this brutal 8-year-long war in which over 13,000 people died. Zelensky was elected on a mandate to make peace with the rebels in the Donbass, to implement the Minsk Accords. What happened, though, he was immediately threatened. The far right held rallies, threatening to kill him. And so the only force that could have saved him and actually pushed through peace would be the US, because the US, after the coup, has major leverage inside Ukraine. That's just obvious. Look no further than the fact that Hunter Biden got a Burisma board seat to speak to how influential the US is, especially Joe Biden. And so Joe Biden, after coming in, could have said he has Zelensky's back on neutrality, and he could have Zelensky's back on implementing the Minsk Accords and ending the Donbass war. Instead, he encouraged Zelensky to crack down on his opposition. That's why in early 2021, right after Biden took office, Zelensky banned 3 major opposition television networks. Soon after that, he went after the main opposition leader inside Ukraine, who was tied to Russia. And meanwhile, the US and Ukraine under Biden and Zelensky signed all these agreements, basically deepening US Ukrainian military integration and enshrining NATO membership as a goal. So that's what the US did. At every step of the way, the US encouraged Zelensky to not make peace with Russia. And Biden effectively took the side of Ukraine's neo-Nazis, not the Ukrainian people who had elected Zelensky on an overwhelming mandate to make peace.
And so why would the United States want to bait Putin and Russia into invading Ukraine? Well, one reason would be because they had a deal with Germany that if Russia did invade Ukraine, that Germany would stop that Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so that's maybe why Biden wanted to, and the administration of the United States wanted to bait Putin into doing just that. And so now, I don't know if you know, as we reported, the United States now has a deal to sell more liquefied natural gas to Europe. Where right now, Russia provides 40% of the gas to Europe, and that's too much for the people in the United States. They figured out here, the fossil fuel companies, Exxon has figured out, we can provide that for the people of Europe. We don't need, and so they did that exact, so it looks as if they did that exact thing that would provoke, and of course, it's a fossil fuel war again. And I want to show you this. So there is Zelensky admitting that they will never allow him in NATO, but he's going to still publicly pretend. And now this is his political advisor. This is Oleksiy. Anyway, here's what he says about this is from 2019. So this is the president of Ukraine's advisor in 2019, and he's going to tell you how they instituted or instigated this war. Watch. You know what? Turn it down and I'll read it. So take down the volume and then I'll just read it. So she says, she asked, so if Ukraine receives nuclear or weapons from NATO, what will that do? And he says, in this case, we can speak about some dates of termination of war in the East. No, we don't. Hang on. I got to back it up. No, we don't speak about any dates of termination of war, he says. Quite the opposite. It will most likely prompt Russia to launch a large-scale military operation against Ukraine. Huh? Yeah. Because they'll have to degrade us. So if they get weapons from NATO, he's saying in 2019, it'll probably prompt Russia to invade them because they'll have to degrade us. Okay. Keep going. In terms of infrastructure, and to turn everything here into a devastated territory. So they'll have to degrade them in terms of infrastructure, okay, so that the NATO would be reluctant in accepting us. So he's saying that Russia would then decimate Ukraine to make it not that attractive of a place for NATO to want to absorb into NATO. That's what he's saying. And then she says, you mean that Russia will dare to directly confront NATO? He said, of course, Russia. No, not NATO. They must do this before we join NATO, meaning Russia has to invade Ukraine before Ukraine joins NATO to make us not interesting for NATO. So you get it. He's saying, so that we become uninteresting as a havoc territory. So if Russia destroys Ukraine, NATO won't want to bring Ukraine into NATO, like we said. So now he says, with the probability of 99.9%, our price for joining NATO is a big war with Russia. So this is in 2019, Zelensky's own advisor saying that if we join NATO, the price that we're going to have to pay for that is a big war with Russia. And if we do not join NATO, its absorption by Russia within 10 to 12 years. So he's saying that if our two options are we either go have a full-out war with Russia or Russia's going to absorb us into they're behind their red curtain that doesn't exist. Here's the fork we're facing now. That's the challenge. And now let's make a choice. But wait, if we put it on the scales, what better is the case? What's better in this case? Of course, large-scale war with Russia and joining NATO as a result of the defeat of Russia. That's the coolest thing. So that's what their choice is. Their choice, he doesn't want to be absorbed into Russia, which is BS. But that's this false dichotomy, is either full-out war with Russia and then join NATO, or be absorbed into Russia. And he's saying we are choosing a large-scale war with Russia and then joining NATO. That's what Zelensky's advisor is saying that they want in 2019. Okay, see if there's more to this. He says that's the coolest thing, a war with Russia. And what can a large-scale war with Russia be like? Well, if it's offensive invasion of 4 Russian armies they created on our borders, so you get the pic. So I don't need to show you anymore. You got it. So let me bring in Aaron. Aaron, that part about Russia absorbing Ukraine, what do you say about that?
No evidence for that. It is true that Russia took Crimea in 2014, but the reason they did that was obvious, and everybody across the Russian political spectrum supported it. You had a coup in 2014 backed by the US. The coup government was immediately talking about joining NATO. And so you had the prospect for Russia of its most important naval base in Crimea, where the majority of the population speaks Russian and identifies with Russia, falling into NATO. And so Russia acted quickly and absorbed it. And by the way, this was happening in parallel with the war in the Donbass beginning and the coup government essentially declaring an assault on the Russian-speaking population. But Russia didn't go beyond that. And even when the breakaway republics of the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, wanted to become independent, wanted to essentially join Russia, Putin refused to recognize them as independent. Russia was advocating for the Minsk Accords, which I talked about earlier, this agreement under which these Donbass regions would stay inside Ukraine's borders, but get some limited autonomy. And that would be and in return for that, they would be demilitarized, and that would end the Donbass war. It was Russia that was advocating for that to be implemented. So Russia was advocating for a peace deal that respected Ukraine's borders, with the exception of Crimea, which they took, and again, which, according to all polls, the majority of the population in Crimea supported Russia taking it, and even Alexei Navalny inside Russia supported that move as well, just because Crimea was seen as so integral to Russia's security. And so this notion that he has that if we don't join NATO, then Russia's going to take us over in 10, 12 years, there's no evidence for that. And in fact, look, if you go back to the coup of 2014, the problem there was the US and the EU insisting that Ukraine make a choice between, it was either Russia or the West, because the EU was trying to force Ukraine to sign this economic deal that would have essentially cut off Ukraine's ties to Russia and also accept really, really harsh austerity. And for Ukraine, that was just suicidal, especially when you have a large segment of the population in Ukraine, although it's declined because people have left and because of the war. A large segment of the population speaks Russian, identifies with Russia, and wants to maintain ties to Russia. And that's why it's suicidal in that situation to force Ukraine into one camp or the other. It would be crazy for Russia to try to force Ukraine into its own camp at the exclusion of all those who don't want to be a part of or want to be tied with Russia. But it's also just as crazy, which has been the US-led policy, to try to force Ukraine into the US-led camp, essentially into NATO and the EU. And the answer in a divided country is to respect that division and keep the country neutral, because otherwise you're always going to have conflicts brewing up. And by the way, that's exactly what William Burns, the current ambassador to the CIA, predicted back when he was Russia's ambassador to the US. He wrote that famous memo that we know about thanks to WikiLeaks, warning that across the Russian spectrum, he was being told that NATO was a red line, that NATO membership for Ukraine was a red line for Russia, because it would force Russia one day to intervene if there was going to be an internal civil conflict, which is exactly what has happened.
So here, who's this colonel?
This is Doug McGregor. He served in the Gulf War. He was a tank commander and led a famous battle there where the U.S. was victorious in the first Gulf War. And then in the 1990s, he was a strategic military planner for NATO during its bombing of Yugoslavia. Okay. And then he served under Trump at the end of Trump's administration as a senior advisor.
And so he's saying what we all know. Here he says it.
The question is, what is it that Zelensky is going to do? The Russians have made it very clear what they want is a neutral Ukraine. This could have ended days ago if he accepted that. And then they can adjust the borders. But the eastern part of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. But again, the Russians are not seizing territory. They're destroying Ukrainian forces. That's their focus.
Colonel, it sounds like you don't approve of Zelensky's stand.
Oh, I think Zelensky is a puppet. And he is putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk. And quite frankly, most of what comes out of Ukraine is debunked as lies within 24 to 48 hours. The notions of taking and retaking airfields, all of this is nonsense. It hasn't happened.
He's not a hero when he's standing up for himself and his own people? You don't think he's a hero?
No, I do not. I don't see anything heroic about the man. And I think the most heroic thing that he can do right now is to come to terms with reality. Neutralize Ukraine. This is not a bad thing. A neutral Ukraine would be good for us as well as for Russia. It would create the buffer that, frankly, both sides want. But he's, I think, being told to hang on and try to drag this out, which is tragic for the people that have to live through this.
I'm inclined to disagree.
And he's dragging it out. We all know how this is going to end. We all know how this is going to end. Ukraine has to end up neutral. They're not going to beat Russia in a war. And this is what Russia's demands were. The Kremlin has announced its demand. Ukraine must change its constitution to guarantee it won't join any blocs, meaning NATO. Must recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Must recognize the Eastern Separatist region as independent, meaning the Donbass. And they have, so the first thing would be to stop shelling and killing the people in the Donbass, which they were supposed to do according to the Minsk agreement, but they never did. So we all know this is how it's supposed to end, but the United States and NATO and Zelensky doesn't seem like they want an end to this, right?
No, it doesn't. That's why the U.S. is shipping in weapons, even though everyone knows that no matter what the U.S. does, Russia will always have the military advantage. That's why the reason the Minsk Accords happened is because Barack Obama ignored and overruled all of his top aides, including Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, all of them saying we have to arm Ukraine to fight this proxy war that we began with the coup in 2014. And Obama refused. He worried that, first of all, the weapons would fall into the hands of Nazis, which is exactly correct. And he also pointed out that no matter what we do, Russia will always have military dominance. So if you pour weapons in, all you're doing is prolonging the war. All you're doing is sentencing more Ukrainians to die. So that's why the Minsk Accords happened, is because Ukraine militarily was weak back then. But when Obama left office, there's that clip of Lindsey Graham and John McCain. They go to the front line in Ukraine and they say 2017 will be the year of offense. And they used Russiagate to achieve that because Trump came in. He's being called the Russian puppet. He needs the support of Republicans in case he gets impeached as the Mueller investigation is going on. He caved pretty quickly and he sent the weapons to Ukraine that Obama would not send. And Biden comes into office and basically picks up where him and Jake Sullivan had left off, where they were urging Obama to arm Ukraine, use Ukrainians as cannon fodder. And now Obama is out of the way and they've picked that up. And here we are.
Come see a live stand-up show or be in Orlando, Tampa, Cleveland, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, Omaha, Des Moines, everywhere. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for our live show tickets. Also, become a premium member, get access to all our extra stuff, and help support the show. See you at a live show. Single tickets now available. Single tickets available.